Thank you for your support, everyone. It means the world. We're so grateful.
It began in a room where the air felt heavy enough to slice with a knife, a government conference hall in Ouagadougou, late afternoon light pouring through half-closed blinds. At the head of the table sat the First Lady of Burkina Faso, not as a ceremonial figure, but as a strategist. Before her, a thick leather-bound case snapped open with a precise click. Inside, color-coded spreadsheets, satellite imagery of mining sites, and a stack of contracts stamped with seals from 3 continents. Her hand, steady, deliberate, slid one particular contract to the center. This was the document that had kept her awake for weeks. Few in the room knew her true professional past. Before politics, she was a forensic financial analyst for an international compliance agency, the kind of expert corporations feared when audits turned forensic. She'd spent years dissecting paper trails, hunting for hidden clauses, and shell companies that could disappear billions without leaving a fingerprint. And now, she had turned that skill inward against a network operating inside her own country. The discovery didn't come from a dramatic whistleblower or a hacked database. It was a single faint line, barely visible under normal light, buried at the bottom of a contract signed in 2011 between Burkina Faso's Ministry of Mines and a consortium of global operators. Printed in invisible ink, designed to appear only under UV light, it outlined a production adjustment formula, so vague it could mean anything, and for the past decade, it had meant everything to those exploiting it. Her analysis showed a staggering pattern. Official records reported gold output far lower than satellite-verified extraction levels. The gap wasn't small over 10 years. It amounted to billions in undeclared exports, routed through offshore accounts and subsidiaries in tax havens. The math was cold, clinical, and devastating. If correct, it meant Burkina Faso had been bled for over $10 billion, while schools went unfunded, hospitals lacked medicine, and villages waited for clean water. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. She placed her pen on the contract, looked up at the officials around her, and asked one simple question. If this is true, how many people knew? But the real question, the one still hanging in the air, was even sharper. If one woman could uncover a scheme this vast, what would happen when the president himself decided to step into the fight? The contract lay in the center of the table like a silent piece of evidence. But now, the investigation had a pulse. The First Lady's voice was calm, deliberate, yet each word landed with the weight of a gavel. She turned a page in her dossier and tapped on a chart. "This is not one company," she said, her eyes sweeping across the room. "This is just the first. There are 11 more." Behind her, a projection screen flickered to life, revealing a spiderweb of corporate registrations. Shell companies scattered across Malta, Switzerland, and the British Virgin Islands. Each line on the diagram traced the path of gold revenues, disguised as logistics fees, technical consultations, and market adjustments, moving through offshore accounts before vanishing into financial secrecy. To anyone else, it was an abstract puzzle. To her trained eye, it was a map of extraction not from the earth, but from a nation's veins. The tension deepened as the door to the conference room opened. President Ibrahim Traoré stepped in, uniform pressed, expression unreadable. He didn't take a seat. Instead, he scanned the faces of the executives, lawyers, and ministry officials gathered at the table. Then, in a voice that carried both command and restraint, he said, "You have one opportunity to tell the truth here, in this room, before the truth finds you in court." At that moment, the click of camera shutters broke the silence. Through a partially open door, reporters could be seen lining the corridor, lenses aimed through the gap. The meeting was no longer just an internal review. It had become an impromptu public hearing. Microphones from the national broadcaster picked up every word, and within minutes, the scene was live across Burkina Faso. Some executives shifted uncomfortably. Others stared back with carefully composed neutrality. Outside, social media feeds began to fill with screenshots of the corporate map and the president's challenge. Analysts debated whether this was a bold anti-corruption stand or a dangerous gamble against some of the most powerful mining interests on the planet. But in that room, the stakes were simpler, sharper. It was no longer about contracts or clauses, it was about whether a nation could confront the forces that had shaped its economy for decades. And the unspoken question hovered above it all: when the lights of the cameras stay on, who will still dare to speak? The courthouse in Ouagadougou had never seen a morning like this. By 8 a.m., the front steps were lined with citizens, journalists, and diplomats, all pressing forward to witness what the press was already calling the trial that could redraw the map of Burkina Faso's mining industry. Inside, the chamber was stark yet symbolic. 3 judges sat high on the bench, their robes tailored from Faso d'Anfani, the traditional woven cloth that had come to represent national sovereignty. When the proceedings opened, the First Lady stepped to the center with a measured confidence. In her hands was not just paper, but the product of months of forensic work. She began by presenting a side-by-side comparison, declared production versus satellite-verified extraction from 4 major gold mines. Her figures were exact, cross-referenced against customs data and shipping manifests. The gap was undeniable: $2.8 billion in undeclared revenue over a decade from just these 4 sites. Defense counsel immediately rose, objecting to the use of satellite imagery as inadmissible and beyond the technical scope of the court. But the presiding judge leaned forward, conferred briefly with his colleagues, and delivered a decisive ruling: the evidence would stand. A projector whirred to life, filling the chamber wall with 2 maps. The first, the official corporate production report, its numbers neatly aligned. The second, a high-resolution satellite composite showing truck convoys, excavation patterns, and storage facilities far exceeding declared capacity. The contrast was jarring. Where the first map told a story of modest, regulated output, the second revealed a far more aggressive extraction pattern, a visual narrative of wealth, leaving the country without traceable return. In the gallery, murmurs rose. Outside, radio hosts relayed the images in real time, describing them to listeners across the capital. As the session moved forward, the atmosphere shifted from curiosity to reckoning. This was no longer a technical dispute over accounting methods, it was a question of national equity, of whether the structures designed to protect a country's resources could be turned against it. And as the judges prepared to hear the next piece of testimony, one thought pressed in on everyone present: if this was what could be uncovered in daylight, what still remained hidden in the shadows? The turning point came without warning. In the middle of the cross-examination, the First Lady walked to a large whiteboard, positioned beside the judge's bench. 2 columns had been drawn in thick black marker. On the left, declared. On the right, extracted. Beneath each heading, figures were written with clinical precision, official company reports on one side, satellite and customs-verified data on the other. The discrepancy was not subtle. In some rows, the extracted gold was nearly double what had been declared. A defense attorney rose sharply, objecting to the methodology. He cited procedural rules, questioning the admissibility of evidence obtained through non-traditional monitoring. But before he could continue, she reached for a bound copy of Burkina Faso's revised mining code, opened to a highlighted clause, and read it aloud. All evidence obtained through state-verified means, including geospatial imaging, shall be admissible in proceedings concerning the exploitation of national resources. The courtroom fell silent. Then she turned back to the board, drew a single line under the bottom figures, and asked the question that would leave an entire country restless: where is the revenue from Lot 42? The question hung in the air. At the defense table, silence. In the gallery, a ripple of whispers spread. None of the executives could produce an answer, not a report, not an explanation, not even a deflection. The judge's pen paused mid-note. Outside the courthouse, journalists repeated the question into live microphones. Within hours, it had leapt from the steps of the Ouagadougou High Court onto radio waves, Twitter feeds, and WhatsApp groups across the nation. By evening, where is the revenue from Lot 42? Was no longer a legal inquiry, it had become a civic demand. Protest banners carried it through the streets. University lectures dissected it as a case study in resource governance. Even in rural markets, vendors wrote it on cardboard signs next to baskets of grain, turning a courtroom phrase into a national refrain. Inside the court, the First Lady stood motionless, watching the faces in front of her. She hadn't raised her voice, but the weight of her words had shifted the entire balance of the trial. And beyond the courthouse doors, one question began to crystallize. If one missing revenue stream could unite a nation, what would happen when all the others came to light? The shock came less than 48 hours before the court was set to resume. Thomas van der Velde, a Belgian accountant, and the prosecution's key witness vanished. His apartment in Ouagadougou stood empty, the front door locked from the inside, passport gone, no flight records, no messages, no trace. For weeks, he had been the quiet linchpin of the case, the man who knew the flow of gold from Burkina Faso's mines to offshore accounts, line by line, ledger by ledger. His sudden disappearance sent ripples through the trial, raising whispered questions about pressure, threats, and the reach of the mining network. The First Lady did not speak publicly. Instead, under the cover of an official economic delegation, she boarded a night flight from Ouagadougou to Brussels. The mission was unofficial, the itinerary unwritten. In a modest townhouse in Schaerbeek, she met Clara van der Velde, Thomas's younger sister, who had been living in quiet fear since her brother's last encrypted message. If anything happens to me, she will know what to do. Over tea that went cold, Clara slid a small metal USB drive across the table. "This is everything," she whispered. Inside were thousands of pages of accounting records, shell company registrations, and most damning, a recorded video confession from Thomas himself. In it, he calmly described how senior executives in a European mining conglomerate had falsified export declarations and routed excess production through an unregistered subsidiary in Gibraltar. Dates, shipment codes, wire transfer receipts, every detail was there. 2 days later, back in Ouagadougou, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. As proceedings resumed, the First Lady stood, her voice steady as she presented the USB to the bench. The projector lit up once again, this time with Thomas's face filling the wall. His testimony unfolded in measured, deliberate sentences, the data aligning with the prosecution's earlier satellite and customs evidence. Then came the slide that froze the room, a direct email exchange between the conglomerate's CEO in Europe and a local subsidiary manager explicitly approving the diversion of unreported gold shipments worth hundreds of millions. The silence that followed was not just legal, it was moral. Judges leaned in, pens motionless. Even the defense attorneys avoided eye contact. Outside, the question began to take shape in the public's mind. If one missing witness could speak this loudly from the shadows, what would the truth sound like when all voices were finally heard? The breakthrough arrived in the form of a single, unassuming sheet of paper, page 73, of a thick corporate dossier seized during discovery. As the First Lady laid it on the evidence table, the camera zoomed in, revealing a short handwritten note in the margin. "Fix royalty trail." 2 visible, followed by the unmistakable signature of the European conglomerate's CEO. In the precise world of corporate law, those 6 words were not casual scribbles. They were intent. Intent to obscure, to conceal, to make the nation's gold invisible on the books. But the revelation didn't end there. A young intern named Issa Fana, barely 24 and fresh from the University of Ouagadougou, had been combing through the original contracts stored in the Ministry of Mines archive. Under a blacklight in a dimly lit records room, he noticed faint lettering emerging on one of the older pages, a clause written in invisible ink. It was the real contract, hidden beneath the official copy filed for public record. The clause granted the company unprecedented privileges, the right to self-report production figures, delay government audits for up to 5 years, and legally transfer funds abroad without triggering compliance reviews. When both pieces of evidence were displayed in court, the CEO's handwritten instruction and the hidden ink contract, the defense's carefully constructed strategy, collapsed. The courtroom felt the shift instantly. Lawyers who had spent weeks challenging satellite imagery and financial records now sat in silence, their arguments reduced to technicalities that no longer mattered. The judges leaned over to confer, their expressions a mix of restraint and recognition. In the gallery, journalists exchanged glances. They knew they were witnessing the unraveling of a decade-long arrangement that had siphoned billions from Burkina Faso's soil to foreign vaults. Outside, radio commentators replayed the details for a country already hanging on every turn of the case. These were not just legal exhibits, they were symbols of how impunity hides in plain sight, and how sometimes it takes the smallest discovery to dismantle the largest deceptions. And as the gavel prepared to fall on the next phase of the trial, one question echoed beyond the walls of the Ouagadougou courthouse. If invisible ink could rewrite a nation's fortune in secret, what other truths were still waiting to be brought into the light? The final day of the trial began under a heavy sky, as if the air itself carried the weight of what was about to be decided. Inside the Ouagadougou High Court, the three judges returned to the bench, their expressions deliberate, their words measured. In a verdict that would reverberate far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the court ordered the mining conglomerates to return $10 billion in misappropriated revenues. Licenses linked to fraudulent reporting were revoked effective immediately. And, in a decisive move to prevent further delay tactics, the ruling barred any appeals filed outside the national jurisdiction. The era of hiding disputes, in distant courts, was over. The announcement was met with a silence, more powerful than applause. Lawyers shuffled their papers, knowing the scale of the precedent just set. For years, complex contracts and offshore arbitration had kept African resource cases out of African hands. Today, that chain had been broken. But the transformation did not end in the courtroom. Within weeks, Burkina Faso's National Assembly convened in a special session. On the agenda, the Resource Transparency and Governance Act, a sweeping piece of legislation designed to close the very loopholes that had allowed the fraud to persist. The law mandated that every mining, oil, and gas contract be made public within 7 days of signing. Summaries of key terms would be read on national radio stations in all major languages, ensuring that even remote communities understood what was being extracted from their land, by whom, and under what terms. Perhaps most striking was the creation of an independent civil audit council, composed not of politicians, but of teachers, engineers, community elders, and journalists. This body was granted full authority to review production data, audit accounts, and recommend prosecution if discrepancies were found. For a nation long accustomed to hearing about its resources only through foreign press releases, this was a radical change in who held the keys to information. The First Lady, whose relentless work had driven the investigation, declined public honors. No award ceremony, no televised speech. When asked by a reporter why, she replied simply, "This is not my victory. It is a return of what was already yours." Then she returned to her office, papers already stacked high with the next set of cases to review. Outside, people gathered in markets, bus stations, and schools to discuss the new law, holding photocopies of its clauses, as if they were passports to a new kind of citizenship. But even as the ink dried on the legislation, one question loomed over the celebrations. If this level of transparency could be won here, how long before it was demanded everywhere? In the months that followed, her face began appearing in places she had never sought. Not on campaign posters or magazine covers, but painted high on the walls of Ouagadougou's old neighborhoods, a woman with a file folder under one arm, and a flashlight in her other hand, illuminating a ledger. In markets, she was called the Shadow Minister, the one who worked without title, without ceremony, but whose actions shifted the ground beneath the nation's feet. In schoolyards, teachers told the story of the trial that brought the gold home, and children began saying they wanted to be auditors, investigators, people who could read the hidden lines no one else noticed. The effect was not contained by borders. In Accra, Ghana's parliament approved a bill to create a citizen audit council, modeled after Burkina Faso's ESA. In Dodoma, Tanzania, mining contracts began being read live on community radio. In Niamey, Niger's civil society groups launched Open Mines, a digital platform that allowed anyone to search and compare export records. These were not coordinated campaigns, they were sparks catching in dry grass, a shift in the political weather of a continent. And yet, she stayed out of the spotlight. While the $10 billion restitution dominated headlines, she kept repeating the same line to anyone who tried to frame it as her personal victory. The money is important, but the real change is that people now read and ask. That was the quiet revolution, the movement from silence to inquiry, from assumption to evidence. In marketplaces, once too busy for anything but trade, people now paused to discuss clauses, royalties, and audit reports. The language of resource governance, once the private code of boardrooms, had become part of everyday conversation. And with that came something more powerful than any court order, a population no longer waiting for permission to demand clarity. Her work had started as an investigation. It became a legal case, but its final form was something harder to define, a collective muscle memory, a habit of asking, "Where is the revenue?" before trusting the numbers on a page. And that may be the deepest legacy of the fight. Not that a nation won back what was taken, but that its people learned the tools to guard what remains. In the end, the true measure of victory was not in the billions returned, but in the millions now standing watch. If this story moved you, save this video, share it with someone who still believes change is impossible, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Because the next fight for transparency may not start in a courtroom, it might start with a single question you decide to ask.